In this video, we reconstruct one of the most troubling expeditions ever recorded on Mount Everest. A family entered the death zone under the supervision of experienced Sherpas who, long before the summit push began, had already identified that the climbers did not possess the skills or conditioning required to survive at extreme altitude. The outcome was not unexpected. It was anticipated, discussed, and quietly accepted as the climb continued upward. At 27,800 feet above sea level, survival was already unlikely. The team was operating inside the death zone, an altitude range where the human body begins to deteriorate immediately and continuously. Oxygen pressure at this height was less than 1/3 of what it is at sea level. Temperatures remained below -30 degrees Celsius. Wind speeds fluctuated between 20 and 40 kilometers per hour. There was no physiological adaptation available at this elevation, only borrowed time. By the moment they reached this height, the sequence leading to failure was already in motion. What followed was not a sudden disaster, but a slow and measurable collapse. Each decision reduced available oxygen reserves. Each pause consumed strength that could not be recovered. Each delay narrowed the remaining options for descent. The mountain offered no external support. Helicopter rescue was impossible at this altitude. Medical evacuation did not exist. Any serious failure would have to be managed by the climbers and Sherpas already attached to the fixed rope, using only the equipment they carried and the strength remaining in their bodies. The Sherpas on the route understood these limits. They had seen the pattern before. They knew what happened when pace fell below minimum thresholds. They knew how quickly judgment deteriorated as oxygen margins shrank. They knew that once certain altitudes were crossed, descent became a calculation rather than a choice. The deaths that followed were not the result of chance. They were the outcome of a process that unfolded step by step, narrowing until no safe exit remained. The expedition took place during the spring climbing season, the narrow window between late April and early June when Mount Everest briefly becomes accessible. The date was set within this period, when summit attempts were concentrated into only a few days of stable weather. Dozens of teams were positioned on the mountain, all dependent on the same forecasts and the same limited margin of safety. The route followed the southeast ridge, beginning from the South Col at approximately 7,950 meters, or 26,085 feet. From this point upward, climbers entered the death zone. Atmospheric pressure dropped sharply. At the South Col, available oxygen was already below 35% of sea level conditions. Higher on the ridge, that figure fell further with every step. Temperatures during the summit push range between -25 and -32 degrees Celsius. Wind speeds were inconsistent, averaging 20 kilometers per hour, but rising suddenly in exposed sections. These conditions increased heat loss and accelerated oxygen consumption. Even minor delays carried measurable consequences. Weather forecasts issued before the climb showed a brief stabilization window of less than 48 hours. Outside that window, jet stream winds were expected to return, pushing speeds beyond safe limits. This created time pressure across all expeditions. Teams delayed at lower altitude risked missing the window entirely. Teams that moved too slowly higher up risked exhaustion before descent. The fixed rope system had already been installed along the route, anchoring climbers to the ridge and controlling movement. This created bottlenecks at steep sections and technical steps. Progress was not continuous. It stopped and started, dictated by congestion rather than individual ability. By the time this expedition departed Camp 4, the safety margin was already narrow. Oxygen calculations assumed steady movement, predictable rest intervals, and no significant delays. Any deviation from that plan would compound rapidly. At this altitude, recovery time did not exist. Every pause consumed oxygen. Every delay shortened the descent window. The environment did not allow correction. It only recorded time and subtracted reserves. The climbers were a family group attempting Mount Everest together. 2 adults and 1 younger member formed the core of the team. The adults were in their early 40s. Both lived at sea level and worked in professional office-based roles. Neither had a background in high-altitude occupations or endurance sports at elevation. Their previous climbing experience included guided ascents on lower peaks, none above 6,500 meters. Acclimatization had been completed according to a standard commercial schedule, but without extended rotations or prolonged exposure above Camp 3. Their motivation was not unusual. The climb had been planned for several years and framed as a shared family achievement. Financial resources were sufficient to purchase a full-service guided expedition, including personal Sherpa support, supplemental oxygen, and priority logistics. The permits, logistics fees, and guiding services placed the total cost well above the average rate for the season. The payments secured access, not capability. The lead Sherpa assigned to the family had extensive experience. He had summited Everest more than 10 times and had worked across multiple commercial expeditions. His responsibilities included route navigation, oxygen management, pace control, and emergency decision-making. He was familiar with the southeast ridge and with the operational pressures common during peak summit windows. Supporting Sherpas rotated along the route, assisting with fixed rope management, oxygen cache placement, and congestion control. Several of them had already expressed concerns about the family's movement efficiency during earlier acclimatization rotations. These concerns were communicated informally between Sherpas and, in some cases, to expedition staff. They were not formally escalated. The guides operated within a commercial system that limited authority. Clients retained final decision-making power unless they were physically incapacitated. Turning a paying client around carried financial consequences, reputational risk, and the potential loss of future work. Sherpas relied on successful summits for bonuses and repeat contracts. The pressure was not explicit, but it was present. No individual involved acted with malicious intent. The climbers trusted the system they had paid to enter. The Sherpas trusted their experience and the standard protocols they had followed many times before. Responsibility was distributed across decisions, assumptions, and incentives. Each person operated within constraints that narrowed options without immediately appearing dangerous. At lower altitude, these limitations could have been corrected. Higher on the mountain, they became fixed conditions. The first indicators of trouble appeared well before the summit push began. During acclimatization rotations between Camp 2 and Camp 3, the family's movement speed consistently fell below that of other climbers on the same schedule. Sherpas monitoring ascent times recorded delays of 20 to 30 minutes on sections that normally required half that time. These delays were attributed to fatigue rather than terrain difficulty. Health checks conducted at Camp 3 showed irregular recovery patterns. Resting heart rates remained elevated after periods of inactivity, and oxygen saturation readings measured by pulse oximeters were lower than expected for climbers who had completed multiple rotations. One reading taken in the evening showed saturation below 70% while at rest. This was noted, but not considered disqualifying under commercial expedition standards. Signs of inadequate acclimatization became more apparent during rest days. Headaches persisted longer than normal. Appetite was reduced. Sleep quality was poor despite the use of supplemental oxygen at night. These symptoms suggested limited physiological adaptation, but they were common enough among clients that they did not trigger immediate intervention. Equipment checks raised additional concerns. Oxygen masks were functional, but regulators required repeated adjustment to maintain steady flow. Cold, stiffened tubing and one mask seal showed minor leakage that reduced efficiency under load. The issues were addressed with temporary fixes rather than full replacement, as spare components were limited higher on the mountain. Experience gaps became visible during basic rope handling. One climber required assistance attaching an ascender correctly during a rotation above Camp 3. The error was corrected quickly, but it indicated unfamiliarity with tasks that should have been automatic at that stage. Sherpas assisting on the rope exchanged brief remarks acknowledging the problem. Clear warnings were issued, though not formally documented. A senior Sherpa advised that the family's pace would become dangerous above the South Colonel. Another guide suggested delaying the summit attempt to allow additional rest or a further rotation. These recommendations were discussed and ultimately dismissed due to weather timing and schedule constraints. The expedition continued according to plan. None of the individual issues appeared catastrophic in isolation. Each was logged mentally, then set aside. The assumption remained that guided support and supplemental oxygen would compensate for deficiencies. At lower altitude, that assumption often held true. Above Camp 4, it would not. The summit push began shortly after 2100 hours from Camp 4. The initial pace was slow, but within acceptable limits for a commercial team. The temperature hovered near minus 28 degrees Celsius. Wind remained moderate. Oxygen flow rates were set higher than planned to compensate for the family's reduced speed. This adjustment immediately increased consumption and reduced reserve margins. Within the first hour, the lead Sherpa noted that one climber required frequent pauses. The stops were brief, less than 30 seconds, but they disrupted rhythm and increased exposure. A suggestion was made to maintain continuous movement, even at a slower pace. The advice was acknowledged. The pattern did not change. They continued upward. By 23:30, the first measurable delay had accumulated. They were approximately 20 minutes behind the planned schedule. Oxygen gauges showed slightly higher usage than projected. The Sherpa communicated that catching up would require maintaining pace through steeper sections. The family agreed. The terrain steepened. Movement slowed further. Around midnight, congestion on the fixed rope forced an unplanned stop. Other teams were ascending and descending through the same narrow section. The halt lasted 12 minutes. During this time, oxygen continued flowing. Body heat dropped. One climber's hands showed reduced dexterity, requiring assistance to redrip the rope when movement resumed. This was observed and noted. No decision was made to descend. At 1:15, another warning was given. The Sherpa stated that turnaround time was approaching and that delays were accumulating faster than expected. The family asked how much margin remained. The answer was imprecise. Weather remained stable. They continued upward. As altitude increased, breathing became more labored. Oxygen flow was increased again on one system to offset visible fatigue. This provided temporary relief, but further reduced remaining supply. The Sherpa recalculated mentally and recognized that descent would require careful rationing. He did not communicate this explicitly. By 2:30, the team reached an elevation where most climbers would normally pass without extended stops. They paused again, this time for nearly 3 minutes. One climber leaned heavily on the fixed rope, indicating reduced leg strength. Another Sherpa from a different team observed this and advised slowing oxygen flow to preserve reserves. The suggestion conflicted with the immediate need to keep moving. It was not followed. At 3:10, the group was now more than 40 minutes behind schedule. The wind increased briefly, raising wind chill and increasing oxygen demand. A discussion occurred about whether to continue. The Sherpa stated that descent would be difficult but still possible. The family expressed a desire to proceed. No one was incapacitated. The climb continued. Physical decline became more visible after 3:45. Speech was limited. Movements were mechanical. One climber stumbled while stepping over a minor ice bulge but was caught by the rope system. This incident did not result in injury, but confirmed diminishing coordination. A warning was given to remain focused and conserve movement. It did not change outcomes. Oxygen indicators showed that reserve levels were approaching thresholds earlier than planned. One bottle that should have been at 60% was closer to 50. This was not immediately critical, but it removed flexibility. Any additional delay would force reliance on spare supplies. At 4:20, the Sherpa advised that if progress did not improve within the next 30 minutes, descent would be necessary regardless of position. The terrain ahead was more exposed. Bottlenecks were visible above. The family acknowledged the warning. Progress did not improve. By 4:50, the 30-minute window had passed. The team was higher than planned and more committed to the route. Descending now would require navigating the same congested sections against oncoming climbers. The Sherpa hesitated. The family did not initiate descent. They moved higher. At approximately 5:15, the first signs of hypoxia became unmistakable. One climber paused without clear reason and failed to respond immediately when addressed. The Sherpa adjusted the oxygen mask and confirmed flow. The climber resumed movement after a short delay. This intervention consumed more time. Another warning was issued, this time more direct. The Sherpa stated that reserves were no longer sufficient for a normal descent. He indicated that spare oxygen would be required if they continued. The family did not stop. They advanced. As dawn approached, visibility improved, but conditions worsened. Wind increased again. Temperatures dropped. The pace slowed to a fraction of what had been planned. The escalation loop had completed multiple cycles. Warning given, warning acknowledged. Ascent continued, condition deteriorated. By this stage, descent was no longer a clean option. The energy required to reverse direction exceeded what remained. The mountain had narrowed the choices to only one remaining path, and that path continued upward. Above 8,000 meters, the expedition entered the upper death zone. At this altitude, atmospheric pressure dropped to roughly 33% of sea level values. Each breath delivered insufficient oxygen to sustain cellular function without supplementation. The human body could not recover. It could only continue consuming limited reserves. Oxygen planning for this section was based on strict math. Each climber carried a primary bottle rated for approximately 4 hours at a flow rate of 2 liters per minute. Descent calculations assumed that at least half of that supply would remain upon reaching the turnaround altitude. By the time the team crossed this threshold, gauges showed significantly lower margins. 2 systems were already below 45% capacity. Time pressure intensified immediately. Weather models had indicated that wind speeds would increase after sunrise as upper-level systems shifted. That shift began earlier than predicted. Wind rose to sustained speeds near 30 kilometers per hour with higher gusts on exposed sections. Wind chill increased oxygen consumption and accelerated fatigue. Turning back at this point required reversing direction through congestion on a narrow ridge. Descending climbers had to yield to those still ascending. Each pause would drain oxygen without forward progress. The Sherpa calculated that even an immediate descent would push oxygen supplies to critical levels before reaching Camp 4. The physical state of the climbers further limited options. Muscle strength had degraded. Balance was unreliable. Decision-making speed had slowed. These effects were consistent with prolonged hypoxia and could not be reversed at this elevation. The final factor was position. The team was now committed above multiple technical sections that required controlled upward movement. Downclimbing these sections while fatigued and oxygen depleted carried its own lethal risk. The margin for a controlled retreat had already been consumed during earlier delays. At this stage, continuing upward and attempting to manage failure higher on the route appeared, operationally, no worse than turning back. That assessment was flawed, but it was made within narrowing constraints. From this point forward, survival depended not on decisions, but on remaining oxygen, weather stability, and physical endurance that was already failing. Mechanical reliability declined rapidly above 8,300 meters. Oxygen delivery systems that functioned adequately at lower altitude became unstable under sustained cold exposure. Regulators stiffened as internal components cooled. Flow rates fluctuated despite unchanged settings. Several climbers experienced intermittent drops in pressure that required manual adjustment to restore output. Masks accumulated condensation with each exhalation. Moisture froze along valves and tubing, partially obstructing airflow. Clearing these blockages required removing gloves, exposing bare skin to temperatures below -30 degrees Celsius. Each adjustment increased frostbite risk and consumed time while oxygen continued to flow. One regulator began delivering inconsistent volume, forcing the climber to increase flow to compensate. This masked the underlying problem while accelerating depletion. Spare components were not immediately accessible. Full replacement would have required stopping in an exposed position and coordinating with other climbers on the rope. The decision was made to continue with the compromised system. Cold also affected battery-powered equipment. Headlamp output weakened as batteries lost capacity, reducing visibility during critical sections. Communication radios produced intermittent static. Transmissions were fragmented and delayed, limiting coordination with other teams. As mechanical systems faltered, physiological failure advanced. At this altitude, oxygen saturation dropped even with supplementation. Cognitive processing slowed. Fine motor control degraded. Tasks requiring simple coordination, such as clipping carabiners or adjusting straps, required repeated attempts. Muscle fatigue progressed to weakness. Legs trembled under load. Rest no longer restored strength. The body entered a state of progressive energy debt, consuming muscle tissue to sustain basic function. Judgment became impaired without obvious awareness of decline. Hypothermia compounded hypoxia. Reduced blood flow to extremities preserved core temperature but diminished sensation and grip strength. Early frostbite signs appeared as stiffness and loss of dexterity rather than pain. These failures did not occur suddenly. They accumulated. Each malfunction and physical limitation reduced redundancy. Systems designed to provide safety margins instead revealed how narrow those margins had become. By the time critical failures were recognized, neither equipment nor the human body had the capacity to recover. As the team continued upward, other climbers on the route began to take notice. Several expeditions were moving through the same section of the ridge, spaced along the fixed rope. These climbers had no direct responsibility for the family, but they observed the same warning signs that the Sherpas had already identified. One climber descending from higher altitude paused briefly and spoke to the lead Sherpa. He reported worsening wind conditions above and significant congestion near the next technical step. He advised turning back while descent was still manageable. The information was accurate and timely. It did not alter the plan. Radio traffic increased as conditions deteriorated. Short transmissions described slowing movement, oxygen concerns, and climbers requiring assistance. Messages overlapped and cut out due to interference. No single authority coordinated responses. Each team operated independently, sharing fragments of information without a mechanism to enforce action. Another Sherpa from a separate expedition commented on the family's pace as they passed. He noted that their movement was inconsistent and that one climber appeared to be relying heavily on the rope for balance. He suggested stopping to reassess oxygen levels. The comment was acknowledged without response. At one point, a climber waiting above during a bottleneck observed prolonged inactivity below and asked over the radio if there was a problem. The reply was brief and nonspecific. Movement resumed shortly afterward, reinforcing the appearance that the situation was under control. These external confirmations accumulated. Multiple independent observers recognized that the team was operating outside normal safety margins. None of them had the authority to intervene directly. Stopping one expedition would have affected dozens of climbers dependent on the same route and weather window. By the time consensus emerged that the situation was critical, the team had moved beyond the last practical intervention point. Oxygen reserves were already depleted beyond recovery margins. Physical decline was advanced. Weather conditions continued to worsen. The warnings were correct. They were simply received too late to change the outcome. At approximately 8:40 local time, at an estimated altitude of 8,450 meters, forward movement stopped. One climber remained clipped to the fixed rope, but was no longer lifting their feet. The pause lasted 90 seconds. No verbal response was recorded. Oxygen flow was checked and confirmed. Movement resumed briefly. At 8:52, the climber stopped again. This time, there was no attempt to continue upward. The lead Sherpa moved down the rope to assess. Breathing was rapid but shallow. Balance was absent without rope support. Oxygen pressure in the primary bottle was near empty. A spare bottle was connected at a higher flow rate. For several minutes, the climber remained upright with assistance. No independent movement occurred. At 9:05, the climber's knees buckled. The harness and ascender held body weight against the rope. Two people supported the torso to prevent rotation. At 9:12, respiration slowed. The oxygen system continued delivering flow. No response followed verbal prompts. At this point, descent was attempted. The effort failed. The climber could not coordinate movement. Supporting climbers were unable to lower body weight safely due to terrain angle and congestion. At 9:26, the oxygen bottle depleted fully. No additional supply was immediately available. Breathing became irregular. At 9:31, respiration ceased. A pulse was not detected. The climber remained suspended on the rope, secured by mechanical systems rather than muscle function. The remaining family members stayed clipped in place. Oxygen supply was critically low. At 9:45, assistance arrived from another team with limited spare oxygen. The supply was connected. The individual did not respond. At 10:08, posture changed. The head dropped forward. Muscle tone diminished. At 10:14, breathing stopped. No further intervention was possible. Both bodies remained attached to the fixed line as other climbers passed during descent. Recovery was deferred due to altitude, weather, and exhaustion. The sequence ended without interruption or deviation. After the incident, surviving climbers descended independently. Several suffered frostbite to fingers and toes. Two required evacuation from Camp 2 by helicopter once weather permitted. No rescues were attempted above Camp 4. The bodies remained on the upper ridge until a later recovery operation deemed conditions acceptable. An internal review was conducted by the expedition operator and the National Mountaineering Authority. Equipment inspections found no single catastrophic defect. Oxygen systems functioned within specifications until depleted. Fixed ropes were correctly installed. Weather forecasts were accurate within expected variance. No violations of permit conditions were identified. The findings focused on decision timing. The first abort point occurred during acclimatization rotations when pace and saturation readings repeatedly fell outside norms. A second abort point occurred at Camp 4 when departure was delayed and oxygen margins were recalculated. A third occurred during the summit push when turnaround time was exceeded without corrective action. A final abort point occurred when spare oxygen was first required to maintain basic movement. None of these points were enforced. Each was treated as recoverable. The investigation concluded that the deaths resulted from cumulative exposure beyond survivable limits, rather than a single failure. No penalties were issued. Operations resumed unchanged.